Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm with James of Prolekult Films, not Pro-Cult Films. That's kind of different. And we are here to talk about the first revisionism controversy, not the second one, which is all about how loyal you were to Stalin after he died, but the first one, which was the Bernstein Kautsky debates. And one of the things about late Frederick Engels, and I'm an Engels defender. I'm not one of these Engels corrupted Marx, theorist. But is he endorsed a lot of people that if he had lived, I think he would have felt really, really kind of sketch about. He gave Werner Sombart a good review. He was close friends with Bernstein. But Bernstein's an interesting figure because I think, while I ultimately think the Bernsteinian answer to the problem of revisionism is, wrong, I think why Bernstein arrived there is actually kind of interesting. And the more I learned about it, the more sympathetic I was to how we got to the revisionism controversy. And I think you have been working on something similar and coming to kind of similar conclusions. So to frame this for my audience, if they're not in the history of the Second International, how did the revisionism controversy actually begin?
So, it begins immediately following Engels' death with an article on the class war in France by Marx, which is about the 1849 French Revolution. And it's really, he begins kind of trying to revise some of Marx's conclusions and coming to different conclusions. But what he's really kind of speaking to is the Foot program, which had a theoretical component, which was attributed to Kautsky, authored by more than just Kautsky, and a practical component, which was authored by Bernstein or attributed to him, but authored by more than just him. And that's installed in 1891 as the sort of revolutionary program within the Social Democrat Party in Germany. And there's a complete division between those two parts. So the first part, the theoretical component, regurgitates the kind of thing we all know about the concentration of capital leading to an growing immiseration in society, a growing polarization between bourgeois class and the proletarian class, and therefore, ends with a proposal for revolution, overthrowing the old order and that kind of stuff. Whereas the practical component orientates the party entirely on kind of like reformist lines, what we would call reformist lines anyway, which is things like universal suffrage, social security, a few other components which are quite important. There's a list in the program. And what Bernstein's really trying to do is a number of things. He's trying to really bring the theory more in line with what the party's actually practically orientated toward. And I think that's actually quite an honourable thing to do. It's upfront. At least it's not kind of using phraseology to then smuggle in a reformist kind of platform, which is something we see a lot now, certainly. But then he's also addressing what he views as inconsistencies within Marx or things within Marx that don't live up to what was actually happening, and particularly the breakdown theory within Marx, the project that kind of growing immiseration of the proletariat. And he's doing this on quite concrete grounds because, like, practically it hadn't happened. And there's a kind of immediacy in interpreting Capital Volume 3 when it gets published. So that people are kind of thinking this breakdown is coming quite soon. And what he's arguing, well, it's not. It's empirically not. That isn't happening. The middle classes are growing. There's still an absolute and relative growth in the number of capitalists within Germany, within France, within England. And we have to observe that empirical data. Whether or not that means we have to revise the theory is a distinct question, but within the context of the time, you can understand that Capital Volume 3 is this massively anticipated work that has taken over a decade since Marx died to complete, and it contains the thesis that capitalism will fall apart and collapse. which had been long awaited and indicated in the footnote in Volume 1. So people were really excited for this and really thought it was going to complete something and explain how short-lived the system was going to be. And he compared that to empirical data and saw that it wasn't bearing out in that context. So there's a real reason why he goes into the theory and begins revising it. It's not some kind of evil way of trying to usurp Marx's title or anything like that. It's a way of trying to say, well, look, this hasn't borne out in our context, and so we need to reorientate to what our party is actually practically doing. And he does that through an open campaign of trying to revise Marx. He doesn't shy away, he doesn't slip things in. He says, like, we need to reevaluate these things quite directly, and goes through systematically trying to do that. And that culminates in a book we now refer to as Evolutionary Socialism, but at the time had a much wordier title, The Problems of Socialism and the Tasks of Social Democracy, I think. And yeah, so he's quite upfront about it, and he gets a lot of support initially as well, which is quite important to recognize too. Like, even Kautsky, who becomes his major theoretical opponent, initially approves of this process of revisionism as bringing the party in line with some concrete information, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of value to it.
So one of the things that got me to take Bernstein more seriously was the realization that he had that the industrial proletariat, as commonly understood at the time, was not more than 50% of the population anywhere.
Mhm.
And to the extent that you limit the proletariat to the industrial proletariat, that's been true for the entire 20th century. And what we've seen is the proletarianization of other priorly non-proletarian classes. And by that, I just mean they don't have productive capital and their wage earners. So, and famously, Capital Volume 3 doesn't even really define proletariat. It stops right at the moment where it would.
Yes.
Um, so there's that. I wanted to ask you though, the inevitability of socialism thesis and the immiseration thesis are bugbears, right?
Yes.
And there are times where Marx undeniably gets them wrong. I mean, even to himself, he admits it to himself. In letters, he's predicting an almost imminent breakdown in 1850. I've had an argument indirectly with Andrew Kleinman and his acolytes that try to convince me that that's not what Marx was saying in the letter, but
Mm.
it's pretty clear that it is. And a lot of Marxist humanists will still argue that breakdown theory is not actually the implication of crisis theory, etc.
Mm.
And even people who are considered fairly orthodox breakdown theorists like Henrik Grossman
Mm.
are actually think they have to correct Marx.
Yes.
So what do you think Marx's actual opinion was on breakdown? Because I can't tell actually going through. And we had, with the caveat is we have a lot more text now than even Bernstein would have had access to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my kind of view on this is that it's unfinished by either Marx or Engels. It's a necessity of the Marxist schema for a few reasons, though. So the first is that if we look at the concept of modes of production as kind of an operative category within Marxist thought, as early as the manifesto, we are talking about something where it has a defined duration, where relations and means of production will come into contradiction with each other. The development of the means of production is constrained by the relations of production, and therefore social systems have to break down. Now, that is very justifiable in a historical sense, and indeed has played out with numerous different societies, well, throughout history, and different modes of production have all broken down up until capitalism, basically. There is, I think, an essence, the way I interpret because I have quite an orthodox reading of breakdown theory in a lot of ways, but more recently I've been thinking about it in terms of kind of it's an object of long duration if we're going to take it seriously. Just like the breakdown of feudalism was an object of long duration when we take it seriously. It didn't
Like
occur.
200 years.
Yeah, arguably 500, if depending on whose kind of definition you go by. Or, I mean, I think Bernagi goes even further than that.
Well, yeah, arguably, for example, they're still feudal landlords in the British Isles. So
yeah, they're they're reliant on ground rent in a very capitalistic way now. But yes, those are still the same families in a lot of instances. Winston Churchill's parents were aristocratic landowners, for example, and you've got that playing out in quite a few British politicians still. But I think it's one of those things where we have to look at value as simultaneously as a conceptual abstraction and a real abstraction. It's both, and it can never not be both. So when we look at the conceptual abstraction, which Marx develops through Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3, and Engels adds a lot of kind of notes on, and so on and so forth, it's a logical kind of process which has certain laws that have to develop. And what that is it's a conceptual proof that capital must break down at a certain point. What it isn't is a prediction on when or exactly what circumstances will really exist within that actual breakdown. And I think that's really important, because value as a real social relationship, as something that actually happens in the world, is very distinct from the ideal concept. And we have that distance of the ideal and the real in a lot of Marx and Engels' writing. So what Marx's offers us, I think, is this is the relation, these are the limits to the relation, and these are the counter tendencies which can shore it up, as far as I can see within this schema so far, where I'm writing from in the late 1800s. And I can show that it has to break down, but how that will actually occur is going to look very different in different contexts, and is going to involve more contradictions than simply an instant dissolving of the ability of capital to socially reproduce itself. And we can see that in a lot of ways now. Like, you look at a lot of like climate investments, for example, um, and like the capitalists who invest in things like carbon capture and the way that we're financializing nature and so on and so forth, they know that those are short-term investment projects, and they don't care. They simply get on with it, make what profit they can, move on. And that is reproducing the capital relationship. It's doing it on an unstable basis. It's doing it on a really unstable basis that is known to everyone who's doing that, but it still allows that reproduction and expansion of capital to happen. And so we have to understand that there's going to be the point of that analysis to Marx is that this concept shows that capital is going to run into contradictions which make it harder and harder for capitalism to socially reproduce itself. But that social reproduction is a real thing, and that's what we need to be looking at. I
This
hope that
brings
makes sense.
it makes sense to me. I mean, I am not I'm a long durée breakdown theorist. I famously don't think there's going to be one final crisis, for example. Even though I do think the crises increase, I've also thought that the kind of modern economic, periodizations of capital itself are helpful in understanding like internal epicycles within capital. Although epicycle is an unfortunate term because epicycles are things from Ptolemaic count. But what I mean is, like, you can see a couple of business cycles, capital management operates it this way. But if we look at, and we see this in the political organization of capital, but we also do see real profitability declines and stuff that's perfectly consistent with everything we saw and described in, Capital 1 through 3, when also added theories of surplus value and parts of the Grundrisse.
Yeah. But it's interesting how those kind of work out, right? So, like, sectorally, we can see there is an acute overaccumulation crisis in agriculture at the moment. How sustained that's going to be and what that's going to actually mean depends on a lot of things, because it depends on how many of those farmers actually fold. It depends on whether or not they can be incorporated into monopolistic concerns that can still make profit, however thin, on that overaccumulation. It depends on environmental conditions quite a lot,
Mhm.
and it depends on whether or not there is a technological innovation which allows for a profitable cycle, which are all real things that we can't predict. Like, we can assert Maslow's law on the technological thing, but sure, that will have its limits and its guesswork.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I have done that has made my more classically inclined Marxist friends a little uncomfortable is increasingly incorporating complexity theory in all this, because I think that, talking about capitalism as a totality is very useful, but sometimes we can see patterns that fit Marxist predictions sectionally, but we don't see them all at the same time everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is a complication. But I guess to take it back to Bernstein, um, you know, Bernstein famously was involved in the party unification Congress, New Ingalls, New Babel,
Hmm.
New Liebknecht. So definitely knew uh, is there from the early days. I mean, arguably he's there before Kautsky. Um,
He's certainly closer to Engels than Kautsky. He was Engels's executor.
right. Um, he also was part of the Party Unification Congress with the Lassalleans. Even though Marx was backing the Eisenknachers, we all know that the critique of the Goethe program is not actually printed till far later, for
Mhm.
the sake of working class unity. Uh, Bernstein's involved in that, and one of the things that I have not loved about the way we teach the kind of straw man of the revisionist controversies is that a lot of this is left out. It's just erased from Bernstein's history.
Mhm.
Um, why, uh, you know, why is this such a flashpoint? I mean, even now, I guess because the conclusions obviously are uncomfortable. And Luxemburg's famous pamphlet, Reform and Revolution, is pretty clearly aimed at Bernstein.
Mhm.
But um, why do we have trouble looking at the second international and say 1895, where this seemed like a reasonable debate to have?
I think there's a lot of distancing that's gone on from the actual context, and there's not a lot of work that goes into examining the context because I mean, like, part of the reason I wanted to write about this actually is that I think what we see now is revisionism is mobilized primarily as an insult to denounce people whose arguments you don't actually want to engage with. And that's the kind of primary use that it has on the contemporary left, is that it's my orthodoxy is correct and everyone who disagrees with me is a revisionist in some capacity. And to preserve that political category, you can't then turn back and go, well, these were reasonable debates in the period. They were interpreted as reasonable debates within the period, not just by Bernstein or his followers, but by Kautsky and his followers too. Um, they had huge implications on the Second International. They locate the result of the controversy locates the SPD as a firm authority on Marxism within the Second International, which had been a wavering thing before these debates, partially because of these debates. Um, and I think that that's a really uncomfortable thing. It also requires us to really go into the material basis and the fact that this was an inevitable confrontation that couldn't be shied away from within the way that Marxism was developing in that period. So we have here in the kind of period that the revisionist debate actually begins to kind of shape up. In the lead into that, we have obviously the death of Engels in 1895, which leaves a sort of power vacuum in terms of who's the chief interpreter of Marxism, and that's partially what's at stake for both Kautsky and Bernstein, although reluctantly on both their parts, I think, is an attempt to claim that mantle as the authority, as well as a lot of social contradictions and problems within Germany that aren't really that well known and are quite complicated, which makes the way that this debate developed really important. So the SPD, I'm sure most people know, was the first like mass Marxist party that had ever really existed. And that puts you in a lot of different positions simultaneously. It puts you in a position of international contest, because this is where French parties are forming, Italian parties are forming, Belgian parties are forming, and everyone's kind of trying to define the policy that would come to be within the Second International. And indeed, there's a lot of suspicion, particularly on the Germans' part, but also on the French part, about joining the organization because they didn't want to be dominated by people in another country, and didn't want to have their practices and theory set by people in another country. So there's a very conscious need for theoretical consistency in order to be able to compete within the Second International to take that spot, which was inevitably what did end up happening in the end. The Germans win out and end up dictating French policy, keeping quite a lot of prominent figures in the French movement from ever assuming office within the French Republic in that period, which is an uncomfortable fact to have to attribute to an orthodoxy that you want to nominally defend, at least as a political instrument. Then there's a lot of problems which come out of the conclusions of the debate, but we might deal with them a little later. The social conditions in Germany really need to be understood. So the 1880s, which is the kind of decade prefacing these debates, is a really, really rapid period in capitalism's development across Europe, and a really important period, which sees the end of sort of what some people refer to as the first globalization, what is probably better understood as a European free market with America. As tariffs are reintroduced by Germany onto goods, French tariffs go up again. England starts to consider introducing new tariffs in order to compete with the US, which can produce lower cost goods in the face of rising demand. So that leads to quite a large expectation that there is going to be an international competition or development in that direction, which the socialist parties of all these countries need to prepare for. But it also comes alongside mass industrialization, particularly in Germany. We're talking about between 1870 and 1914, to give a kind of broad overview. Industrial production increases by output increases by 500%. That leads to rapid urbanization, rapid masses of proletarian people forming, which need to be incorporated within the Bismarckian Empire for that empire to survive in this period. And that's really important because that leads to a number of things. It leads to the growth of unions initially, which are different to the workers' associations that had previously existed, that had been more about professional standards and like professional support to their members, and leads to the strike becoming a real tactic. Um, and that's new. That's very new in this period, and is not something that is like very well understood yet, which is why we can sort of look at Luxemburg's kind of view on the mass strike as actually an innovation. Um, then we also see that being incorporated largely within the SPD, due to the anti-socialist legislation that's passed by Bismarck in the 1870s to the 1890s, which effectively bans all party activity. Doesn't allow you to have meetings, doesn't allow you to have a local socialist association. Any politicians associated with the socialist movement can literally be expelled from the districts in which they live. And in the same period, the Bismarck Empire institutes some reforms, some social security, and so on and so forth. So it's trying to squeeze this movement. But at the same time, what that ends up doing is it leads to trade union suppression more than it leads to party suppression, which leads to the growth of the SPD inordinately. But primarily it's bureaucratic sectors. So primarily it's party bureaucracy, it's party administrative sectors, and involves a lot of lawyers and professionals who join the party, who fundamentally become the social basis of both camps in the revisionist controversy. This is not a question that is being fought by grassroots trade union members a lot of the time. It's more and more fought among kind of that administrative section. And we also have with that some regional disparities. So southern German members within the SPD tend to, like lay members, tend to align with revisionism a lot more, because they, unlike the kind of national government, which is run quite differently to how any other parliament in Europe is run in this period, in that you can be a member of the Reichstag, but you can't propose legislation when you're elected. Your entire role within the Reichstag is to approve budgets and legislation passed by the imperial government, which is appointed by the chancellor, who is appointed by the emperor. And so real reform's not on the cards here. What is on the cards here is party building alliances within that parliament to act as a like basically as a lobby on the imperial government, and that's the only actual purpose of parliamentary like delegates. So what that does, that's the national framework, and then in southern Germany you have local government where people still can pass some policies within their kind of local areas, and still can engage in some kind of what we would understand more as reformism in an actual practical way. And so there's a divide between people who are largely within Prussia in Germany, and people in the south. And orthodoxy ends up kind of having to get rid of the concerns of the southern German party members in order to reinstate itself and pursue the policy of proletarian isolationism that Kautsky wants to pursue. So there's a lot of uncomfortable and concrete things that come up with revisionism, which actually do situate it as a social question and not just as a purity of doctrine question, which is how we like to talk about it on the left today.
So, the purity of doctrine question and the move towards Marxist, orthodox Marxism, a concept that I will probably never forgive Lukács for, to be honest. Like I hold him personally accountable for that. That it seems to me in this time that we reread the revision debates partly from their results, but also partly from the use of anti-revisionism in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Like,
yes.
Where it is purely, it's not even about orthodoxy of opinion. It's literally about fidelity to one period of one state's development. So that's a very different kind of question. Still material, very much social, but it's different. It's fundamentally different. And we read that back onto the Bernstein-Kautsky revisionist debates mainly because of a similarity in wording and I guess a deliberate attempt to link the two changes. But I've always found that somewhat, I mean, even before I was as well read on this as I am now, somewhat questionable for the reasons why you say in context, but also because particularly when you consider how little of Marx and Engels' overall output was even available at the time, it seems completely clear that the standard interpretation of Marx as believed in the 1890s was wrong. Like, whether or not you think that is Marxist interpretation is another question, but it was wrong. Like, there was no final collapse of capitalism after the end of the Long Depression.
Yeah.
And that has haunted Marxists multiple times. I mean, I think about the predictions by everybody from Trotsky to the Soviet Union to left communists that in the 1950s that the war had stalled the final collapse. It was finally going to happen, and it never does. So to go back to the original context here, why? I guess one question that one has to ask, given the way it's talked about in terms of purity now, why doesn't this split the SPD like the war votes did? Like, why is this not an occasion for a split?
So I think the reasons for that is that that there's a few reasons. The first of which is that a lot of the theory is not actually what the substance of the debate is about.
Got it.
So I think Bernstein is theoretically wrong. I think he has empirical reasons for believing what he believes, but I think he's theoretically wrong. But the practical question was about forming alliances within the Reichstag, whether or not that was right to do, whether or not we should pursue a policy of trying to ally with, say, Christian parties that also opposed votes on, also opposed war credits um, on the invasion of France, for example, or whether or not we should pursue a pure policy of proletarian isolationism. The reason it ends up not splitting the party as thoroughly is that we are also dealing with a social basis of invested institutional interests in the party. People like to reduce this to like a class question, but I think we all know that class isn't the only thing that plays into political like conflicts, and it's not the only like ultimate interest. The long-term interest of the class is not the only interests that figure for people within these debates. And so the basis of revisionism and the basis of the orthodoxy is largely derived from an inflated party administrative sector, which does have dominance over the workers' movement. And it's split in a number of very strange ways. So the social basis of revisionism within the SPD is you have practicing lawyers who are still working within the Bismarckian Empire's courts in a professional capacity, and journalists who work for the broader popular press, but not necessarily. They'll write for the party press, but that's not their only kind of income. um, Alongside the southern German members who are very resistant to the orthodoxy because of their ability to participate at a local level of government. And so you have a lot of different sectional interests that align around revisionism that don't necessarily have to take the theoretical component of it that seriously, but it's a window into getting other objectives that they want. Um, Similarly, around Kautsky, you have a very uneasy alliance of people that provide the basis for the eventual victory of orthodoxy. So you have, on the one hand, people who are dedicated communists within the professional strata of the SPD, who we would still interpret as like quite down the line Marxists, and those often are. So, for example, one of the largest sectors is lawyers who only practice in the defense of the party membership. They don't do anything other than defend the party membership in court. That is their job. And so they're more likely to ally with a policy of proletarian isolation on a principled level, like believing in the theory and being more invested in it. But they are also allied with disbarred lawyers, so people who feel like the society had cast them out and weren't necessarily allied on proletarian isolationism on a like theoretical level as a principle, but were simply doing it because that's the circumstance they'd ended up in, and they wanted to have a bigger voice than the practicing lawyers within the party. Similarly, journalists, you have people who only write for the party press and are therefore more likely to go for a pure kind of Marxist thing so they can have more prominence within the party press than the people who also work for bourgeois newspapers in their view. And so you have a lot of different sectional interests playing off against each other who, whilst this is a stake on the things that they want, it's not an existential stake for their position within the party or an existential stake for their political project. At least it doesn't seem to be. And I think that is possibly why it doesn't result in such a big split. Although I do think that's a difficult question because it's also about unity needed in the Second International and the ability, whether or not the national presence of the German party is more important to them within the Second International than the way that's achieved. So once the orthodoxy kind of debate wins out, the SPD takes an increasingly prominent role in the Second International. And so perhaps that role internationally is enough for these people, and they don't need to split on the basis that they would lose that even if their theoretical position has lost out. So I think there's a lot of different factors, and none of them are really that clear cut. It's also kind of straightforwardly the SPD is the only vehicle going. And if you're going to try and form something else, you are going to be very unpopular. The SPD are very popular. They get, in the year after they're unbanned and able to stand candidates, they get a fifth of the vote nationally, 35 seats in the Reichstag, and over 1.5 million, 1.5 million votes. So, like, there's not really much possibility of doing anything else as well, which might explain that too.
So I guess the other question then is what are the ripple effects in socialist movements outside of Germany?
So, I mean, you see parallel processes to this playing out in France, particularly Italy, and Belgium are kind of the
Mm-hmm.
hotspots for this, where you have reform or revolution being posited as a question in those parties, those are actually a lot more cut and dry, because those parliaments do allow you to propose legislation. In Italy, for example, there's a reactionary advance which would have seen the Italian Socialist Party completely banned unless they had made a parliamentary alliance and fought for legislation to maintain their legality. Similarly, in France, you have fights for universal suffrage taking precedent, and things like that. The consequence in the long term, though, is that you have the SPD demanding this kind of policy of proletarian isolationism within the Second International. And so you have like quite prominent figures in France who can't assume political office without breaching their commitments to the Second International, which you could view, I guess you could view as a positive thing if you are just completely opposed to parliamentary participation. But within the practical kind of constraints of the French movement in that period, I think that was a blow. Peter Nettle, who is a New Left theorist who wrote on this in the 60s, makes some really good points on the kind of way that this plays out, in that it kind of leads to a situation where, is it Peter Nettle? Sorry, it might be McClellan, or it was one of the theorists I read on this. Sorry, in that it leads to a similar dynamic to the Comintern, imposing kind of the Russian party through the Comintern, imposing disastrous policies on different parties in different times, because it doesn't have a knowledge of the situation and it has that theoretical weight within the international.
Mm. So, how are the initial responses to Bernstein's original work? How does that go exactly?
It takes a long time to form. Like Bernstein, it's really bizarre because, like, I think this is quite hard to understand from our context, where if you go like, I have questions about value theory, you are immediately lambasted and denounced as a heretic. Whereas back in this period, it takes like literally years for a sustained response to form to Bernstein. His articles are quite well received. Kautsky is even publishing these in his newspaper, the newspaper he edits in this time period. The book is well received to a point. Kautsky writes to Bernstein and says that you've overthrown our philosophy, and that's positive. What matters is what you actually say is new. And that's what's going to determine my attitude toward it. So there's a long period of allowing this to land. People are annoyed about it to a degree within the theoretical leadership of the SPD, but they don't really launch a sustained response. They allow Bernstein to get his initial arguments out the door and include them as theoretical discussions and so on and so forth. That, in this period, has always been the attitude of the SPD, though. There's a lot of freedom of expression within the party in this period. One of the consequences of the revisionist controversy is that ends from the 1910s on. So that's one negative, disastrous problem, and is part of the reason why Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht end up having to be as radical in the split as they do. But it's generally received as a kind of like, well, he's presenting empirical data, he's presenting problems. This is theoretically inconsistent. There's some back and forth, but there's no like denunciations or anything like that going on initially.
Mm. Once the debate starts getting going, how does it affect the actual politics of the SPD during this period?
Very little. I think
Yeah.
that's the core of it, right? Like the SPD was always kind of very divorced from parliamentary struggle anyway. It would vote against war credits, but there's not much else that you can really do. It will vote against certain kind of imperial government policies. It will abstain on others. It won't enter into dialogue with other parties to form an alliance, and refuses to do so all the time. That doesn't change. On the ground activities is mostly popular press. There is no theory relating organization to politics in this period. That has not been really seriously written about, and indeed isn't until Luxemburg and Lenin's interventions. Largely, this is still support for unionism, support for strikes through a party press, through occasional demonstrations, and then parliamentary representation and trying to gain votes in the elections. Neither Kautsky nor Bernstein at any, like Bernstein obviously not, but Kautsky at no point thinks that there needs to be a complete abstinence from bourgeois parliament. Indeed, his view of socialism, even after Marxist orthodoxy is established, is that the socialists need a majority in parliament to enforce things. And that needs to be such a sheer majority that they can just do it without any opposition or any kind of need of alliances, rather than an alliance electoral bloc kind of position.
Mm. So, interestingly, we can't really attribute this debate to the beginnings of the formation of the sort of socialist right within the SPD.
No, I don't think so.
All right. Which is kind of my understanding too, but you would think, by the way this is normally characterized, that it was like the first step in that direction.
Peter Nettle, it is Peter Nettle this time, argues that the split in socialism and the formation of the socialist right within the SPD is actually entirely contained within the orthodoxy camp, which is an interesting one. He argues that it's, so I went through before and I was saying there's a mismatch between those people who are sincerely committed to revolution as an ideological practice, like socialist lawyers or people who work exclusively for the party press on an ideological basis, and and then those who are doing so because they're disbarred lawyers or they can't gain employment within the newspapers in the way that they used to after their socialist convictions are outed in public. And he argues that the rightward turn forms a basis on those who were disbarred or those who were kind of cast out of their practices, because as crisis deepens in the lead up to the world wars, those people are needed again and they can be reincorporated within the German state, and so they are, and that leads them to kind of abandon this position in favor of kind of more support for um, for eventually for the World War. But yeah, it's a complicated one. Yeah.
That's I mean, I think that actually feels pretty accurate to me when I look at the actual positions, and I know when the United SPD forms way later. I mean, this is not part of this controversy; it's really part of the 1914 controversy. That the revisionists are actually, closer to the Zimmerwald left than a lot of some of the more orthodox, and so that makes sense as a process that would lead to that particular weird constellation. In addition to Bernstein's increasingly hesitant views on violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How much does Bernstein's views on violence actually factor into the initial debates?
Not terribly much. Again, it's mostly argued at the level of value theory and breakdown theory. There are some aside elements, but he does view that this. Okay, so it's not that it doesn't feature; it's that he is primarily arguing that a harmonious development to socialism is possible, rather than that violence is abhorrent. He is arguing that it is possible to move toward socialism through capitalist development, and in his view that is happening. So his argument for greater democratic incorporation of the proletariat, and he doesn't just mean in like suffrage as a, because that's already broadly been achieved in Germany for men at least over 25. um, he's arguing in terms of incorporation into German civil society. He's arguing interpretation into kind of um, different kind of cultural aspects of German society. He's arguing that that happening is a way of kind of harmoniously developing towards socialism as things develop, and that particularly the expanding middle strata, in his view, are going to side with the workers, and that can lead to a democratic imposition of socialism, which he also views as the real movement of capitalism. View any he doesn't basically view class antagonism and class polarization as happening. And so this opens the possibility of a transition without violence. Whether or not violence is desirable or not doesn't really enter into the argument, because it's not argued in a moral register a lot of the time.
So, How does this actually lead to the formation of? We've already kind of said it doesn't lead to the formation of the socialist right, but we do. It does seem crucial in a kind of consolidation of a socialist communist left and a Marxist socialist center.
Mm.
Um, how does that happen? Like, it doesn't seem to be an immediate result of the debate. So how does it happen?
So I mean, it's not. It's kind of flows from the debate, but isn't resolved or kind of entering into the debate itself. So it flows out of the resolutions. So in a large sense, the resolution, as I've said, the resolution of the orthodoxy debate was necessary for the SPD to function within the Second International as a kind of consolidated ideological bloc that could assert itself. That's really important because the lesson learned is that this kind of culture of freedom of criticism within the SPD is gradually eroded as other problems form. And so by the 1910s, you start to get that being shut down, political debates within the SPD being shut down, which is part of the reason why the kind of Zimmerwald left feels it need to break and why we get that process happening. Um, and then the Marxist center kind of rests upon the interpretation of the orthodoxy, but without any way of relating it to practice. So they kind of sit there quite contentedly, thinking the breakdown's going to be inevitable, um, and not needing to really debate these things anymore, whilst also kind of trying to kind of manage political activity in the same way that they were, which leads to increasing parliamentary participation, reintegration into the bourgeois state, and so on and so forth, as crisis tendencies bite, which then also ultimately leads to um, kind of that kind of turn toward a kind of socialist center, I think.
Right. And I guess the division later on in the socialist center being like Hilferding versus Kautsky, who maintains breakdown theory later.
Sort of, it's an interesting contradiction within Kautsky because I think his theory of ultra imperialism kind of actually ends up going against breakdown theory quite
Me
strongly.
too. Me actually that I've never been able to square that, because his theory of ultra imperialism, while ultimately incorrect for the time period it's written for, actually does seem correct for post World War II capitalist world. It also doesn't square with his insistence on breakdown theory in his debates with Hilferding.
No,
So I mean, it could just be. I mean, I can chalk it up to Kautsky's inconsistent, but
the turn really comes in 1912 for Kautsky, I think, with the published with Hilferding's Finance Capital and a few other texts coming out around that time. The turn really starts to happen then. Um, because of his view that these cartels are essentially creating greater demand and therefore having, because he views that this is going to have to all come together as an ultra imperialism or like ruin is ahead for all the capitalists, then I guess you can square that circle by seeing he thinks that either they can put it off forever by entering into this unholy ultra imperialist alliance, or they can break down, and he's sort of posing it as an ultimate counter tendency. I think maybe that might be how you could theoretically square that circle.
one of the interesting structural similarities that we can see, though, from both these debates, the evolution versus breakdown debate, is that both, at least 2/3 of the factions of the SPD think that socialism is going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
They differ on how that regardless is going to happen, but it actually doesn't have any immediate implications for political life.
No, there's no tactical conjecture whatsoever within those kind of things, other than do we make alliances within the Reichstag? That's the hinge of the whole issue, really. Um, and whilst that does have some like tactical implications, I don't think that that's enough to like. It's not a strategy, right? It's a do we or don't we question. It's not a how do we work towards this. And indeed, that's kind of where Luxemburg's kind of view of the mass strike stimulating organization has to come from, is because her kind of intervention is in kind of viewing this and saying that while there is no relationship between theory and practice, our organization exists, it is strong, but what is it for? And that ends up being like a really important distinction.
Yeah, and this was always an irony to me about like the 50s revisionist controversies, which again we've already said are completely different, but frame themselves in this debate for probably historical reasons. Is that the anti-revisionist, after they introduced a popular front, actually do the political implications of the evolutionary socialists, but for completely different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's their logic's different, but the actual effects on policy, that's when you have coalitions with bourgeois parties with self-censorship involved.
Mm-hmm.
Like which is, radically different than say the early Third International or even the Second International's positions on this until the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Like and I guess one of the things that I find interesting about this is I agree with you that this conflict is inevitable. Looking at the counter tendencies both in the SPD's historical moment and in like the unfinished nature of Marx's work at that time. So from both standpoints. It seems to me the irony of this is how little political implications it has. Like, even though it seems like it would have massive amounts of political implications because it totally changes your parliamentary strategy, but it ultimately kind of just doesn't. Like,
It has greater political implications for the struggles that come next within the SPD than it does for those that actually it enters into, I think is the way of looking at it that I would take.
Okay. So I guess that gives us to the question, what are the struggles that come next that actually make this matter that don't seem to matter when they're actually having these debates?
So, I mean, the fundamental one is the failure to. So, what Bernstein is doing with revisionism is attempting to realign the party's theoretical outlook with what it's actually practically doing, right? That is actually, there's a degree of honesty within that I think is absent in Kautsky's defense of orthodoxy. Kautsky at no point attempts to relate his theory to any form of action other than the maintenance of a proletarian isolationist position within the Reichstag, and other than his intent to kind of maintain the SPD's domination in both the Second International and within over the unions within Germany. That has huge implications for the development of the Zimmerwald left and for the development of particularly the KPD in Germany, and the way in which this comes about as a split between between Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht's faction and the SPD, because it not only shuts down discussion but also disallows that kind of conversation, because it's essentially already been had, right? If Bernstein was attempting to root the theory in the organization, because I think that is ostensibly what he was attempting to do to make the program consistent, um, then what you end up with is a position where Luxemburg's attempting to relate theory to action and attempting to relate that to extra parliamentary means, which is not what the implications of the orthodoxy suggest. They suggest maintaining a position within parliament just without actually doing any kind of alliance building or anything like that. And that leads to a continued kind of defensive culture within the party's orthodoxy, a continued defensive culture within its spheres of debate. There's a lot of leadership manipulation of debates in terms of how they're framed at congresses, even though there is freedom of expression. But once that ends up going away, what you end up with is an increasingly like a party culture which doesn't want to have debate because of the embarrassments that it suffered in the revisionist controversy from people looking in, because of the international context, because of all these kind of difficult questions. And that really figures, it's a limp orthodoxy that has absolutely nothing to do with practical struggle, essentially. And that is where you get Luxemburg coming in and those splits really mattering. It's also where you get the split between Lenin and Kautsky really mattering, is over the theory of organization and the theory of imperialism. It's also when you get the fundamental split in the socialist movement, which is defined in various different ways, as a split between the labor aristocracy and the workers, or as a split between the communists and the social democrats, really coming to matter, because all of those camps were contained within the orthodoxy, but the orthodoxy kind of smuggled that through without those distinctions actually being visible and those debates ever having to matter. So what you have is you have a false unity on the supporters of the Marxist orthodoxy within the SPD, which smothers up the actual contradictions in their positions and their view of what an orthodoxy is, at the expense of having to argue with something against revisionism, basically. So the argument against revisionism clouds these other splits.
So when it actually does hit in the war bonds vote, it doesn't just split things two ways, the classical communist versus socialist way, but really three. And because it was suppressed, this was not really seen.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think that's the important way of looking at it. Peter Nettle's argument on institutional interests is one way of looking at it, and I think that's a really useful way, because it situates. I think there's a lesson there that, like, these, even like this, what we normally view as kind of theoretical jousting, always does have social stakes, or it wouldn't engage so many people. And what reasons they're involved in those struggles are often very diverse and can't just be broken down into you're a worker, you're a labor aristocrat, you're this, that, the other. It's about where people are located within the institutions, and it's about the actual stakes of those positions.
So, going beyond the immediate implications in Germany and in the the eventual fallout of the SPD, like perpetually between, say, 1914 and the fascist takeover, which is, you just see the SPD continuing to fracture. What are the longer term effects of this debate? I know, and I don't mean the way we talk about it. I mean, what are the kind of like the unseen implications of this debate?
So I think there's quite a lot of them. So it's not just how we talk about the debate. It's about the categories it makes functional within the way that Marxist criticism works. So we have a view, I think, partially as a result of this. Also, I think, as a result of the way this plays out in the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik-Menshevik split as well. But we have a view of orthodoxy or heretics, basically, which plays out again and again and again through the Marxist tradition. Is you are essentially faced with the choice of being either following an orthodoxy or being a heretic. If you're in any social context that matters, that is the position that confronts the Marxist, I think, a lot of the time. Now, in our context, that's much limper, and that's something that I really wanted to write about this for, is to talk about how real tendency formation matters in comparison to the contemporary left in Western Europe and Northern Americas. But that's perhaps getting ahead of ourselves. The other ones are that, as kind of consequence of that, we see a kind of, I think Luxemburg is right in her context of reform of revolution. I think it was correct for her to write in that way. But the kind of binary split between those two things, reform and revolution, that is consequential both of this split and of the later split within the SPD, is a really detrimental one within the kind of way that the movement's literature is shaped and a way that the movement's criticism functions. Because in reality, it's always going to be both to a certain degree. And you can't artificially separate those things out. Whenever we're fighting a union struggle, we are fighting for some kind of reform at some level, within kind of a struggle sense. And revolution is a long-term project, which is not simply kind of reducible to what position you take in relation to reforms. Rejecting parliament does not mean that you are going to lead a revolutionary movement, for example. And
Generally,
I think
it actually doesn't mean that at all.
Yeah, no, quite.
And even people who cite the Bolsheviks for this have to basically periodize the Bolsheviks in a way that excludes, like, I don't know, most of their actual history before 1921. So it's even for the Bolsheviks, whether or not they engaged in parliamentary activity, that was a tactical question and shifted constantly. It wasn't a theoretical or principle one.
Yeah, I think it
So,
also. Sorry, go on.
No. You think it also?
I think also this kind of the way this debate shapes has some really bad implications for certain elements of Marxist theory. So breakdown theory becomes a curiosity, often relegated to the margins of the Marxist movement from this moment on. Like Grossman is one of the only serious writers on breakdown theory for a long time after this debate. And that is a problem that continues to happen. This is like, whilst we have a lot of people who will declare the breakdown is now, it's inevitable, we don't have a lot of people actually examining the theory. And I think that is a consequence of this. Because it becomes a sort of embarrassing thing. We everyone will declare the final breakdowns here, and when they're wrong, they'll just quickly shelve it away, much like the SPD, which is a recurring habit within the Marxist tendency.
Yeah, it makes us look like millennialist Christians. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. So that's. I mean, that is kind of a fundamental irony of this is both the Reformer Revolution, false binary emerges, and the tendency to both maintain breakdown theory but not actually even try to explain what you mean by it emerges. And I don't think people realize that that's actually important for other debates, like imperialism is related to breakdown theory. The third periodism is related to breakdown theory.
Multipolarity debates now.
Yep, related to breakdown theory. Which, although the multipolarity debates related to breakdown theory really pain me because the other side's at least one. I mean, even if you consider BRICS altogether one thing, which I don't, at least 3 out of 5 of those letters are capitalist nations. So,
yes.
It's not. But even the Reformer Revolutionary one, I was talking. I did a show the other day about Vietnamese socialism, and I was like, it's interesting to me that Ho Chi Minh thought has like never been popular on the Western left at all. Because it's like somewhat concessionary to the Western left, actually. Like an official Ho Chi Minh thought after I think 1991, they're like, yeah, we have to acknowledge the actual bourgeois revolutionary and political philosophy of the U.S. and France, even though they were our colonial occupiers. Like, and they actually have had to do both revolutionary. I mean, undeniably, the anti-colonial and socialist development project of Vietnam was a revolutionary process, but also highly reformist in their orientation. And this is also, I mean, it's true for the Bolsheviks too. I mean, in regards to the USSR, you go through like periods of marketization and relative marketization and market reform are nearly constant, actually. As a tension there. So even though it never looks truly like a capitalist market, but that happens there too. So this seems to just lead people to come up with stuff. And by the time you get to my I don't actually hate Lukács altogether as a theorist, but I do hate this. By the time you get to Lukács making his circular theory of orthodox Marxism, where orthodox Marxism is whatever the working class does, and by the working class we mean either the Soviets or later the party, and there's no even content to it. It actually removes debate or development to court. You can't talk about development meaningfully anymore. There is no theoretical development.
Which is the circumstance we're now in on the Western European and North American left. Is you can't talk about those things. It's all contained within these kind of static categories of are you a reformist or are you a revolutionist? Are you a breakdown theorist or a revisionist? None of which has any real content beyond sound and fury. If that, actually.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, when we like one of the things I will say about quote reformist socialists now is they're not even reformist.
No, they're
um,
not.
um so it's something that I think I live a lot with is like we're calling these people reformists. Don't insult reformists that bad. Like I'm not one, but like they had a historical mission and a project and a goal. like like I don't know that we do.
I mean,
um
it's quite telling that like the reformists in Britain, for example, still haven't managed to fulfill the last demand of the Chartists, right? One year parliaments and then we vote on you again to make sure you can get out. Like, you know, like yeah, there's a lot of different tendencies within reformism that are really admirable. And there's a lot of ambitions in reformism that are really admirable at certain points. I don't agree with it, but I think revolution is the way forward, but that doesn't mean you can just dismiss your political opponents because you've assigned a word to them. But yeah, and also yes, the present strain of quote unquote reformists are probably better termed mediationists, maybe.
yeah. Yeah, I think they're media. I might even term them accommodationist, but
Hmm.
which is real mean. But that's like when I get mad at Jacobin magazine and call it Gerongian, and I get really mad at Jacobin magazine and I call it Orleanist. Um, but no one gets my French Revolution jokes. So, um, uh, the one of the things I can say about this is I end up feeling that Bernstein is a sincerely tragic figure, and I end up more frustrated with Kautsky. Like I get,
Hmm.
like I'm a big pusher of like the Lenin Kautsky divide is always overstated.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a huge misrepresentation there. But I also, the more I've learned about this and the more I've learned about Kautsky concessions later, that I've just been like, it would have been a lot better if you actually tried to deduce any political implications of what you were actually doing,
Yeah.
because you don't seem to do that. And when you do, it's usually after the fact. So it's
Normally
that,
after someone else has proposed it as well.
yeah, it, it becomes very frustrating to me the more I deal with it. Um, at the same time, I think it forces the communist left, and this is before we can talk about like left communist proper or left oppositionist, and I always have to remind my audience those are not the same thing.
Hmm.
But it kind of forces them into a bunch of cul-de-sacs too, I think.
Hmm.
Uh,
It
and,
depends which left communists we're talking about, I think.
well, I mean, obviously not Bordigas, because I don't even really know why they're in the infantile disorder book, but but like with counselists, because counselists become more and more intransient on everything.
Yeah.
They become I mean, like, yeah, the national debates, I kind of, I get Panicook's point, but when you start talking about like we're not even going to work with unions,
Mm-hmm.
that seems to be out of, we can make no concession to evolutionaryism because that will be a concession of working class autonomy.
And it's also a conflation, I think, of how to put this. It's a conflation of theory and practical activity that happens through these debates as well. So this is an entirely practical question that's argued theoretically, that then becomes a tenor that is adopted throughout the rest of the Marxist movement's history, where we argue things theoretically when we're actually talking about something eminently practical. And that's a problem
Except
that
when we're
happens
not,
again,
like
except when
when
we're not.
right, like, I mean, one of the things with left communist is that, at least in the Dutch case, after say the 1920s, they really aren't in a position to be eminently practical, and so that kind of does remove it totally to a theoretical realm,
Yeah.
like, um And I think that's, that may be part of what's going on. I don't know. It's hard to say what's going on in the West, particularly when we have to talk about the Anglosphere, but like the American tradition and the British tradition are so extremely different, I think.
I think they are too. Yes.
I
I
think
think
we
there's
are fooled by a common language. So
yes, yes. It's a persistent anger of mine actually because there's been within the time I've been on the left, even a persistent Americanization of British politics, where frameworks from the US are adopted without any kind of critical thought put into the substance whatsoever.
I have noticed that, and it's been an irony to me, uh, because I'm like, we care less and less about you. Why are you adopting our politics? I mean, including on the left. Like for most of my adulthood, the American left, particularly the Trotskyist left, but even the Social Democratic left, looked to Britain for its primary text, for its intellectual leaders, etc. Even in the editorship of, say, the New Left Review,
Mm.
there has been a shift from Britain to the States.
Yep.
But we read it as if we have a common tradition. And my argument is generally like, no, the hell we don't.
No,
Like,
not at all. I mean, like this is something that kind of again comes up in like the early revisionist debate is that a lot of the people who are talking about it kind of say that like there's a continental European tradition and Russia and Britain are outside of it because they're completely different contexts. And to a degree, I think that's true, right? I think Russia, it's very obviously true. Britain, it becomes a little slippery because Bernstein's obviously inspired by the Fabians in some ways, and marginalist theorists from England as well. When he goes to London in his exile, but I think there is a very specific tradition in Britain that is hard to understand unless you kind of live here or have studied it in some depth. Where these ideas and the way they play out just don't actually have that much relevance, either when we look at the reform or revolution question, as it's been adopted in these kind of debates, either through the revisionist debate or the kind of straightforward reform versus revolution debates in the early Second International. That wasn't happening in Britain. What was happening was very, very different with the formation of the Labour Party, and how that's understood is really hard to articulate sometimes.
right. And in the American tradition, there's never a Labor Party. In fact,
Yeah,
laws are passed to make sure it never happens.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and so, it isn't an irony. My other favorite irony is despite the fact that I consider like the Socialist Party of America was in some ways more right wing than the early Labor Party. Um, we voted the right way on war credits,
yeah,
and the war. So
yep,
just and our guy went to prison for it. So it's always been like, when people say there's no left in America, it's actually because it's been buried. But I think that right now leads us to a position, and I'm also just gonna. You want to talk about imminent, real political things? Let's be honest. The defeat of Corbynism is also part of why, and but the Americanization of politics generally, James, seems to be a worldwide phenomenon.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, it definitely
with
is.
the exception of Russia, China, and
S-
maybe India, like, which are pretty big exceptions, but still, it's not just even a European thing.
No, it certainly extends beyond Europe. I mean, like Korea is a very clear example. South Korea.
Absolutely.
Um,
I lived through it. It's absolutely more and more like the United States. Um, in fact, it presages things that happen in the United States.
it
Uh,
does, yeah. Japan does as well, doesn't it?
yeah. Uh,
Um, it's a difficult one to kind of yeah. There's a whole scope of things to talk about there. Um, yeah,
I mean, and I think it's funny because for also most of the U.S. history until very recently, we have been in many ways. since the subsumption of our left into the Democratic Party through the Popular Front, and through a variety. It's not just the Popular Front. When I say that, it makes it sound like it was just ideological. Also, the decline of sharecropping, divisions within the civil rights movement, our own racial history, etc. There has been, we've never really had anything other than play acting the reform or revolution debates, like until relatively recently. So we've had revolutionist parties. I mean, they were very, I mean, arguably, Max Elbaum points out that if you combined all the left factions in America in the late 60s and early 70s, you would have had over 1 million people. But they were all adopting ideologies that were, with the exception of some of the American Trotskyists, actually, who are fairly indigenous, adopting ideologies that were determined by nations outside of the United States.
Which I think, again, that kind of is a consequence of the orthodoxy revisionism debate in a very indirect, long-winded way. There is a way in which in establishing an orthodoxy not only within a single party, but setting the precedent that the international establishes an orthodoxy, then leads to the way in which quote unquote Leninism spreads, leads to the way in which Maoism spreads, leads to the way in which Trotskyism spreads, as this kind of pseudo-internationalist thing, which is often actually derived from very particular conditions. And what we end up with when we kind of put all of these things together is a smorgasbord of orthodoxies which don't relate to any real social conditions, but that the left continues to pluck from a hat.
And so, since it becomes more and more removed from any real struggle, it becomes less and less relevant to any real struggle.
It becomes self-deluding, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, leftist self-deluding. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, in some ways, that's all. In a weird way, this insistence on Marxist orthodoxy actually regresses you back to something like utopian socialism.
Yeah, absolutely does. It there's the old reactionary criticism of Marxists as kind of having a scripture, and I don't think that's true when you actually read the texts and interpret them for what they are, which is they're intended as like what you can get out of them is analytical tools, approaches to the world, ways of viewing social struggle, ultimate objectives, perhaps some kind of way of getting there, and a critique of capitalism that I still think is unmatched. But what you don't get really is a how-to paint-by-numbers guide to building an orthodoxy, building an ideology, and building the practical tools necessary for that. And that's a fundamental contradiction within Marxism that I think is the fundamental contradiction which leads to the orthodoxy revisionism debate in a lot of ways, is that Marxism simultaneously posits itself as a scientific method of viewing the world, a scientific method of inquiry, and a scientific method of like understanding phenomena in the real world, and
Then we have a debate about orthodoxy.
Pardon?
Then we have a debate about orthodoxy.
Well, that's the second position, though, is that it also posits itself as a mass ideological project, and those two things are not compatible a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I would agree with that, and which is not to say that's not to say that like any ideal set doesn't have Darwinism, for example. There was a Darwinist orthodoxy, and then but I don't know, not to get all Stephen Jay Gouldy on things, but if Marxism was still living a scientific tradition, then the orthodoxy question would eventually become irrelevant by actual struggles and actual research and political programs that were just clear. And it puts you and I in a weird situation, actually, because I feel like I'm defending the guy who I think is also historically wrong. But
yes.
But at least he was asking the right questions. When I think about why Bernstein was asking these questions, it feels fundamentally honest to me, even if I think his conclusions are wrong.
I think it's because it's, to me, it's, yeah, so we are kind of in that position, but what I'm kind of think we should frame it as the defense as is his right to be able to make those points and have that line of inquiry, because even being wrong within a theoretical sense is always useful, because you highlight a real question if it's a real, like, if it's an actually worthwhile inquiry, if those are worthwhile questions that are worth debating, then you do highlight something real, even if you do it in the wrong way. And like, Bernstein was highlighting real questions in the sense that he was highlighting the practical concerns of the SPD as it was constituted, and what then we saw was that it lapsed into inaction ultimately. And there was a different critique that could have been made that Luxemburg and Lenin end up making in a very antagonistic way, because they have to. But if that had not been the case, and if there had not been this kind of need to have it as a mass political project up front before you'd sorted out this ideological problem, then that would have been a different state of affairs, I think. But ultimately, that's kind of what ended up happening.
So third periodism, SPD's fault, but not for the reasons why traditionally thought.
Yeah, yeah. Right that way, we get to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting, and I think it's very interesting now in the context of. Actually, this is not directly related, but I wanted to, maybe since you're back on the pond, how bad is it for the British Marxist left right now? Because I get the feeling that like the atmosphere there is very different than the atmosphere here.
Well, I can only speak from my context. I don't know how bad it is in the US, so I can't make
That's
that
actually
comparison.
kind of better for us than it's ever been, but that's actually been bad in and of itself. Um,
Okay, it's horrific in Britain. I think so. I mean, the situation is as such that what we've seen is occasional expressions of like serious dissent through the Kill the Bill protest movement, for example,
mm,
which, whilst I had a lot of problems with it, um, in some ways in terms of its orientation, in that I think it made it about the left rather than about the right to protest per se, and particularly about police violence toward women, which was the inciting kind of moment of that movement. Still did a lot of things and still was probably like the most positive development that there has been on the British left in a long time. It got a lot of sects who wouldn't normally talk to each other talking again, which is something, right? Like,
mm.
um, but it is, since that's sort of dissolved, what we're seeing is really inchoate in every direction. There are some people who are still campaigning on very limited issues, like and there's still a lot of disabled people's organizations, migrant solidarity organizations, and like trans rights organizations and women's rights organizations who are doing good work. But beyond that, it's just absolutely nothing. And it's really
Which is
hard to know what direction to take. Within the Labour Party, there has been a practical severance, which I have been and still maintain that the Labour Party has always been bad for the British left. I'm actually very much on Sylvia Pankhurst's side in that initial ultra leftism debate, because not because I think she was right on principle. I think she was wrong on principle about parliamentary participation. I just think Lenin was wrong
she's
about
just
the Labour
right
Party.
about she's just right about the Labor Party.
Yeah.
Yeah,
um,
makes
and
sense.
bearing in mind she had been in a 10-year relationship with Keir Hardie at that point as well, which she knew the inner machinations incredibly well, right? Like, this is not an
Mm.
uninformed woman. Um, and so, with that said, the dissolution of social democracy within the Labour Party is probably the single most dangerous development that we've seen in a long time. The defeat of Corbynism instituted a horrific reactionary turn. Keir Starmer is one of the most unprincipled politicians in the world, and one of the most dangerous politicians, I think, in Britain. And at the same time, we have the Conservatives advancing ever more reactionary legislation with not very much in the way to stop them apart from the House of Lords, which, when the House of Lords is the last line of defense, you are fucked.
So for our British listeners, the American situation, which I'm probably sure you're tired of hearing about, is both similar and different. Um, we have an organized left in a way we just haven't had forever, but they've actually achieved less than nothing. So that's at least beyond, say, the municipal manorial level. Like they do have some effect in cities, but um, and that's been both weirdly disillusioning because on one hand we have more numbers than we've had probably since the 70s. Um, and on the other hand, and it's coherent, and sects who have hated each other for forever are now talking. And we're having real theoretical debates that aren't just based on play acting historical positions of other places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, however, we are also more wedded to the Democratic Party than before, even
Mm.
more wedded to the Democratic Party than before. And we have a lot of apologists emerging for Bidenism, which just because Biden has not taken as strident a neoliberal tone as, say, early Obama or the Clinton administration, people have assumed that there was a neo-progressivism emerging that there is just no evidence for. And I think we kind of are in different positions where we are in a phase of ineffectiveness but growth. It seems like, Britain is in a different phase, although it's kind of sad in another way because you guys are having labor militancy that we haven't seen since the 70s in response
To
to austerity, and yet the left seems to not really be there.
to a degree,
Um,
it's a difficult one because in a lot of ways that labor militancy has been there. There are some sects that are doing good work who will continue to do good work, but they do it as the unions rather than as the sect. They'll just report it
mhm.
to the sect, um, which is fine, and in many ways I think is actually healthier. Um, but there is a huge problem with that wave of militancy in the sense that, so take the RMT, which was kind of a bit of an ideological breakthrough for the workers' movement, not the socialist movement, the workers' movement distinctly.
Mhm.
And we saw Mick Lynch, who is probably the only fighting union leader we've had in, apart from Bob Crow, who was also the head of the RMT before Mick Lynch, in a long, long,
We've
long
actually
time.
heard of Mick Lynch in America, so that says something.
That does say something. Fucking hell. He was good with the media as well. He knew how to play that game, and but not in a concessionary way. In a way where he would just get his point across and leave,
Mhm.
and was antagonistic with them in a way that I think is Corbyn really could have benefited from himself. Um, but what we do see is that, unfortunately, the RMT was initially campaigning for below inflation pay rises. They knew they were below inflation pay rises. Um, it's not it's militant, but it's not building a worker's stake. It's defending it's a partial defense of what's being lost. So it's not as victorious as it appears on the surface, I think.
This has been my interpretation, but also you must we should go ahead and caveat that I am one of the most seemingly cynical people on the U.S. left. Um, but I have felt like what I've been seeing from Britain is real militancy, but it's real militancy coming from utter defensiveness and losing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That
uh, yeah.
I think that is an honest assessment of the situation. Again, I think I would probably fill the position of one of the most cynical voices on the British left, but that is that is or at least seemingly cynical. Um, that does seem to be the case. I we also have to kind of set this alongside like the migrant situation in Britain is getting like deeply scary. We're getting to a point where people are going to be, if the government gets its go ahead, which it looks like it will, people are going to be put on barges. Slavery protections, modern slavery protections, are going to be withdrawn for any migrant, essentially, um, which is obviously in breach of the European Court of Human Rights, which is entirely the point of it. So we're getting to a point where the Conservative Party feels confident enough in its electoral dominance and its support within Parliament and its support within the social sphere, even after the embarrassment of Johnsonism, that it sincerely thinks it can write a new social contract for Britain in this moment of weakness for the British left. So that's very, very dangerous. Um,
Yeah. And
it's
that's
not
with you guys
Bonapartism.
becoming no, it's not actually interesting. We have a Bonapartist problem. You don't. You can't keep leaders to save your life. Um the I mean, but that's been what's amazing to me. I'm like, well, I've been watching 10 years of Tory leaders just go down in flames, and some new weirdo, bizarro faction of Tories emerges.
Yeah,
Um, uh, it's and yet Labor can't seemingly do anything about that, which is kind of amazing. I mean, like that structurally is not possible in the U.S. like, um, although this may be an argument, one of the things, I mean, one of the most basic things about the differences between strategies between the U.S. and anywhere in Europe is we're not a parliamentary system,
hmm
um, which means all the language, like when we're talking about United Front versus Popular Front versus whatever, I'm like, well, all those strategies can only analogously apply at best here, like,
yeah.
um, and but we do actually have change. It kind of has to change. Whereas you guys, like, you can have a new leader emerge to replace someone within the same party, and we kind of can't do that. Like, the other party will get a chance when that happens. Um,
It's a very. I mean, we've gone through what is it now?
like six.
Yeah, it. I mean, since the last election, since 2019, is three.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So that's three prime ministers that only one of which was voted for. Um, so that's like by anyone other than the Tory party membership, which is like an absurd proposition and should like be enough to have frankly seen the rise in some kind of organized politics. I think like it says a lot to the state of the British left that there isn't a coherent challenge to that, because they have been at like ideologically, Liz Truss was one of the weakest prime ministers, well, the weakest prime minister in British history. She absolutely destroyed herself within 2 weeks, and was somehow also the person to preside over the Queen's funeral, which is such a pertinent symbol of national decay for British people that the fact that we didn't manage to launch anything in that period, even if it was just like a short-lived protest movement, is damning. It's really damning.
I mean, not to continue slagging on Britain, although I must admit to you, James, I like slagging on Britain.
Everyone
Um,
does, including Brits.
yeah, I know it's one of the few things I like about the Brits. No, um, uh, it, in all seriousness, it seems to be, um, particularly the way a lot of people convinced themselves what Corbynism was. The utter defeat of that seems hard for us to understand, and yet
Mm,
this is at the same time where your government seems dead set on, I guess, to spite continental Europe, on making itself an economic equivalent to a medium tier Latin American nation.
mm.
I mean, the economic prognosis for Britain is real
Horrific.
bad. It's
Yeah,
real bad. Like, we don't like the poverty you're dealing with in the UK right now is worse than anywhere in the United States, which,
yeah.
and we are one of the most uneven societies that exists. So, like, that's bad news.
I
Um,
think it's a belated lesson in how parasitic Britain is as a nation, an imperialist nation. Like we are talking orders beyond what like the US. So yeah, people, correct. It's correct that US imperialism does rely on the rest of the world for its wealth, right?
yeah, but we do
That
actually produce stuff.
yeah, um, and but the degree of that parasiticism in the US is nothing compared to Britain, right? Like we're talking that Britain exports in capital, at the last count, 560% of its GDP, which is absolutely insane, right? That means any economic disturbance anywhere in the world directly winds back. And as that has been decreasing, and there's nothing to replace it within the British economy over like the last decade or so, because it was at 1.7 times British GDP that was exported in financial capital, if you include portfolio investments and other derivatives. Um, like when you get to that scale and it starts decreasing, and then you leave the largest trading bloc that you're a part of in order
The,
to restake a claim for the national petty bourgeoisie who are going to be wiped out by that move, you end up in this absolutely absurd position. Which is, I think, why breakdown theory and things like that have become quite important within Britain, and is perhaps another reason that's drawn me back to the revisionist controversy.
because you guys really are breaking down, like,
Yeah,
but it's sadly mostly just you.
yeah.
um, uh, no, I actually, my war with the English in specific is well known. But I actually, when I was looking at the last set of economic stats, I was like, I can't even be mean about this. This is horrific.
Hmm.
And the Tories aren't paying any price for it, which is also horrific. The best I'm going to get out of it is like the de-evolution of a bunch of, you I don't know. I mean, maybe de-evolution of Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, but who knows? Even I'm not even sure about that. So it's the whole thing is kind of sad. Although I will say this: Britain's getting good at exporting its reactionaries to the United States the way that Canada used to do.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. You also get all our failed comedians now as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is that's a reverse. You used to get our failed comedians. So, uh,
we managed to
uh,
change one economic dynamic at least.
no, I mean it is such a. Actually, from the standpoint of quote Marxist orthodoxy unquote, it's very hard to explain what has happened in Britain because it was self-inflicted, or not self-inflicted, self-exaggerated, self-accelerated. Um,
It's I think it's one of those things that it seems absurd from the exterior, right?
yes, it does. Um, we
But
quit.
if you look at the
Yeah,
kind of political basis in the Tory party, there is a line of economic reasoning that does allow you to make sense of it. Um, so the Tory party is people obviously like to characterize it as just the capitalist party, which isn't true because obviously
it's like a
Labour
petty
means
bourgeois and an aristocratic party, right?
yeah, there's certainly that element with elements of monopoly capital, although a lot of monopoly capitalists tend to actually prefer the Labour Party, which is why, say, the City of London's internal management council, which manages its own, like the City of London has its own police force, which is a private police force, which is run by a council of the bankers who live there, who vote Labour for managing that. London, City of London mayor is always a Labour candidate, other than Boris Johnson. He is the only Tory mayor of London in a long, long time. Um, so those are kind of preferences, but there are monopoly capitalists within the Tory party too, obviously, and the split for Brexit was a split between monopoly capitalists who want to remain part of Europe because it wanted to remain part of the European Union because it allowed them freedom of capital throughout, access to the single market, so on and so forth. Whereas the petty bourgeoisie in Britain sincerely had felt they had concerns about sovereignty because they can't exploit migrant labor at the same scale as these monopoly capitalists. Straightforwardly, that was why the contradiction over the border was there, why the contradiction over kind of over the European Union, freedom of movement, and those kind of things. The petty bourgeoisie here sincerely felt that as a sovereignty question because of their economic location and how migrant labor features in British capital, which is at an astonishingly high rate of British capital's profitability wherever it is profitable is because of the exceptionally low rate of money paid to migrants and the degree of not not quite slave labor, but not far from it, that's incorporated within it.
And that was tolerable because of the difference between pound and euro exchange rates. Yeah. I mean, that's something that people miss. You know what's interesting about this though? Your left does not resemble our left anymore. In some, and probably, and as I said, I don't think it ever really did. But your right does resemble our right, which is a mixture of a minority of monopoly capitalist. For us, also extractive industries, which you have, but we have way more of.
They're coming back here. They're coming back here.
Yeah, you'll get them again. And petty bourgeoisie, like whereas the Democratic Party is a weird alliance of most of the monopoly capitalist, the professional strata, and academics, and the very poor. Which is, kind of. The Tories don't quite. I mean, the Tories resemble the Republicans, but Labor does not resemble.
I mean, I think
the same coalition as the Democrats do in America.
No, the Labour Party is an interesting one. I mean, now it's very hard to, much like it's getting harder to say what the hell the Tory Party is. It's also getting harder to say what the Labour Party is, because I mean, so the traditional kind of analysis of the Labour Party that I get from, I guess, the British. How to put this? So it calls itself it frames itself as the British Marxist-Leninist tendency. What it actually is a bit less simple than that. But the old sects who kind of analysed British imperialism and the relationship to the Labour Party was that you have a mixture of a kind of labour aristocracy involved in it. You have a petty bourgeois involved in it. You have a certain degree of monopoly capital and imperialist capital involved and enmeshed in this kind of what is presented as an unholy alliance, which only in very extreme circumstances has ever been able to secure the vote of the very poor within Britain. Generally, the very poor in Britain do not engage politically, and that has been the fate of the British kind of working class for a long, long time, is that the poorest sections of the British working class do not engage in the parliamentary system.
That's so. What is interesting about the United States is that is more racialized. Proletarian people of color tend not to vote, and then interestingly, with the white proletarian, whatever, white working class, whatever weird nomenclature you want to lose, all of which are contested here. It is very different. Our patterns are extremely different, rural and urban, as to who participates in voting amongst the poor.
Well, maybe that's a determinant then, because like we increasingly have less of a rural proletariat. Like it still exists, but it's very small.
Well, we don't really have a rural proletariat either. It does still exist, but it's small. But we have an ex-urban and suburban proletariat, which I don't think you have. Like we just have that. Like and actually that got worse. In the last 20 years, a lot of people who used to live in the inner cities have been priced out into the suburbs, and in this way, we look a lot. The United States is beginning to look a lot more like. We're too much of a diffuse nation to say it's like France, but like the suburbs of France actually are closer to the patterns of development and like the major cities, the rich cities in the U.S., which is a new development of the last 20 years. And so in some ways, we actually look a little bit more like Europe proper. So but our politics is nothing like Europe proper. So, it's hard because when you describe this, I'm like, well, at a superficial level, it looks very similar and increasingly similar than, like, say, the Tories and Labor did in the 70s versus the Democrats and Republicans in the States. Like that was a very there's very big divergence then. Similarly, in like Canada and some of the Commonwealth, the parties there, like Canadian conservatism, has not historically looked at all like American conservatism, and often, you know, its major import to us was oil and reactionaries. And actually, our economy is pretty integrated, but still, that's what people knew, and that has interestingly in Canada seemed to have gone the other direction, whereas like Canadian politics increasingly looks like American, but the party that you can't get rid of is the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is a center. Actually, calling it center left is pretty fucking useless. You know, like a centrist liberal party. So it's interesting, and I just want to bring this out when we talk about. I mean, we started talking about the revisionist controversies, but like all of our debates need to be. Yes, we need to be international, and like the American left and the British left need to be coordinating because we speak a similar language. But we also have to realize that our conditions are extremely different, and trying to view them as the same is going to lead us into weird cul-de-sacs. And it hasn't helped that American academic culture has really picked up from, say, I don't know, French academic culture as the dominant academic culture of the, quote, academic left, unquote. Because I think that's been particularly disastrous in Britain and Europe, where our categories are not helpful for you in the same way.
I'd agree with, yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there's a need to, I think at the core of, say, when we look at the revisionist controversy, or when we look at these kind of disparities in political categories, what we are talking about is a form of discourse that becomes hegemonic over the way that the communist left conducts itself. And I think that's the real problem of the thing, is that these become ironclad theoretical like categories, and whether or not you're on board with the theoretical category comes to replace whether or not you're actually engaged in useful activity in your own context a lot of the time. There's a disdain for the local that flows out of this grand theoretical kind of debate, right? And I think that's one of the problems that's implicit within the revisionist controversy, and part of the way it has served to shape left-wing discourse since then, and particularly in the communist left. But similarly, the Comintern plays a role in that. That however many internationals deep you want to go, play a role in that. But it ends up being this thing where you have a dominant strain within the left that then determines the categories of the rest of the left, which is a hugely detrimental, destructive thing. And the mantle just passes from place to place.
Right. I mean, and from my standpoint, I'm talking to you too. It also makes us unable to understand our different contexts and how we could help or not help our comrades in other countries. You know, I don't know what the U.S. left can really do for the British left at this point, but talking about it accurately would help.
Yeah.
So, you know, and then that I think that's go ahead.
I think that is contingent from a British perspective on the British left actually developing an analysis of what is happening to us, which I don't think we've done.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that would help. It's very tempting to talk about how similar our situations are, because some of these problems are actually the same. The U.S. left has a very weak theory of what's going on, and that's why we're producing weird sectarian hybrids that don't exist anywhere else like crazy right now. MAGA communist, post-leftist, Marxist for Trump, etc.
Oh, the MAGA communists, Jesus.
yeah. I mean, you know, it's weird. LaRoucheism plus CPCMLism plus weird parts of ultra leftism plus not being able to seemingly read. It's I actually should be careful with that, because one of the dangers I think people have with these ideological strains is they assume these people aren't smart. and that's actually not true. Smart and correct are very different things. So, but I will say they have some tortured readings of text. So I guess that this is a good place to end on why this matters, even though it seems very tangential. But I wanted people to kind of see why, framing everything in terms of revisionism and anti-revisionism, and any of the periods you want to do it, actually blinds you to trying to see what the struggles actually are on the ground, and why those debates ever came to be in the first place, because the way we debate them afterwards and the way we debated them when they were happening are totally different. And that's an important lesson. So this is the part where we have to be petty rentiers ourselves. This is unfortunately a development of the modern economy. Thank you, breakdown theory. So what would you like to plug, James?
You can support us on Patreon. $1 gets you access to everything we give out, because I'm a stickler and will never drop that. I want everyone to be able to access it. And that also includes our Discord, where I run at least fortnightly reading groups. Finally got, after a long 2 years, I finally got my Capital reading group through Volume 1. So we'll be starting Volume 2 and a second cohort of Volume 1ers soon. But we also have irregular kind of ones on bring your own text educationals and things like that, where you can bring what you want to discuss and we'll all discuss it. And also video discussions on the Approaching Marxism series I'm developing, which you can find on youtube.com/Prolekult. The next episode of that will be looking at revisionism and orthodoxy, putting this all together in like a digestible 15-minute video for you to kind of use. The ambition with the series that you can use them as an intro to a study group. So you've got a pre-prepared introduction there, and the texts are all laid out, and that's all done. I want it to be kind of useful for that, because I think we are at a point where reading groups and things are probably the most external facing thing we can usefully do to build the Marxist tendency in a lot of ways, outside of doing what practical activism you can within renters unions, actual unions, and so on and so forth, grassroots campaigns. So yeah, if you want to support any of that, then please do. That'd be cool.
All right, thank you, James. I'm going to go ahead and endorse Prolekult Films. You over there across the pond, and the measures taken over here on the west coast of the United States are kind of one of the few people doing this history lesson on the Second International. I got Ben Lewis from I believe he's in the CPGB Provisional Committee. Also does a lot of good work here, but there's not a whole lot of people doing this. So and that's kind of a shame, because we're finally getting a whole lot of these texts and documents and historical records accessibly easily. So I would tell people to support you, particularly for $1. Come on, it's $1. It's $1, man. That's nothing.
Thank you
now
very
that
much,
I know
Governor.
that, I'm also going to go and support you, because it's $1. Fuck it. So thank you so much, and we're gonna end the show right now.